sometimes the same action can be doing Jewish and not doing Jewish. The very same thing. So if I go to a bagel store and I buy bagels because it's part of my Jewish cultural heritage and I have memories of my grandfather hosting bagel brunches, then that's doing Jewish. And if a person of Japanese background walks into the Bruegger's Bagels and buys a bagel, it's not necessarily doing Jewish for them, right? It's the same action, but it depends on who's doing it that might impact whether the particular action is doing Jewish. Reading a Torah scroll is most likely doing Jewish no matter who's doing it, but some actions are flexible. Another example like that, eating Chinese food, not necessarily Jewish. Eating Chinese food on December 25th, now it might be Jewish. Right. The other example is sometimes we use doing Jewish as an excuse for what we want to do anyways. The example is Jewish time. Heard of that? I'm on Jewish time, running on Jewish time. In other words, I'm late. I've also heard of Irish time. I've heard of Italian time. African Americans sometimes use an old phrase CPT, which stands for colored person time. So it turns out that everybody is late except for the WASPs. So we should refer to ethnic time and WASP time. I'll also point out that Jews can get places on time. For example, funerals. You very rarely see someone walk in 15, 20 minutes late to a funeral. Once in a while, but it's unusual. And the other example is the Israeli army. It's not like they show up 30 minutes late to the rendezvous saying, well, my grandma called, and then I had this thing in the oven. It can happen. We can get on time. But we like the excuse. So there's an old saying that goes back to a Yiddish writer named Chaim Sheklovsky, which says, the more Jewish, the more human. The more human, the more Jewish. In other words, Jews are like everybody else, only more so. So what I wanted to do to conclude our discussion on values and commandments is show you a short video clip. This is from an Israeli sketch comedy show called Hayehudim Ba'im, The Jews Are Coming. And it's a scene that depicts Moses receiving the Ten Commandments and delivering it to the people. But as you'll see, its reception is not as automatic as you might assume.
אלה הדיברות שאתם צריכים לקיים. שאלות?
כשאתה אומר לא תישא את שם אדוני לשווא, אז לא הרגע אמרת את השם שלו?
לא, אדוני זה לא השם שלו.
אז איך קוראים לו?
קוראים לו אדוני.
אז כן קוראים לו אדוני.
לא, זה לא השם שלו אדוני. השם שלו מתחיל בי' ונגמר ביוספה.
לא, נו. יודה.
אז לא חשוב, שאלה הבאה.
לא תחמוד אשת רעך. זה אומר שאסור אפילו לחשוב עליה?
נכון.
אפילו אם היא ממש שווה?
כן, גם אם היא ממש שווה.
ואם אני מסתכל עליה, כל הזמן אומר לעצמי, אל תחשוב עליה, אל תחשוב עליה. זה עכשיו שאני חושב עליה?
אני לא יודע, אני אברר לך את זה.
אבל תברר, כי אני לא רוצה ליפול פה על סתירה לוגית.
עוד שאלות!
זה בקשר לכבד את אביך ואת אמך.
נו באמת.
ומה אם נניח אבא שלי רצח מישהו תוך כדי שהוא חושב על אשתו השווה של השכן?
צודק, אם זה המצב, אז אל תכבד. בסדר? עוד שאלות.
לגבי הלא תרצח.
מה לא ברור ולא תרצח? למה צריך להתווכח על כל דבר? לא תרצח, לא תרצח, מה לא ברור פה?
זה כולל המלאקים? כי אתה ביקשת שנמחה את זכרם. עכשיו, כשאני מוחה זכר, אז אני עושה את זה בעזרת רצח. אז אני מפספסת פה משהו.
צודקת, שימי את המלאקים בצד. לא תרצח, לא כולל המלאקים.
הם פלישתים, הם וחיתים.
זה מורים.
נבוסים, בגרגסים.
אבל זה לא מה שאמרתי.
אבל אתה ביקשת מאיתנו שננקה את ארץ ישראל מכל משולש.
אבל זה לא אומר שצריך ישר לרצוח אותם.
מה נעשה איתם? נשלח אותם לשייט?
רבותיי, בסדר, הבנתי, לא תרצח למעט פלישתים, עמלקים, גרגסים, יבוסים, אמורים וחיתים.
ומצרים.
מה מצרים? מה מצרים? את ראית פעם מצרים בארץ כנען?
אתה רצחת פעם מצרי, מה? אז למה לך מותר ולנו לא? מה, אתה יותר טוב מאיתנו?
מה זה?
לא, תראו אותו, כן, מסתובב לו בעולם, רוצח איזה מצרי שבא לו, אבל לנו לא. לנו אסור, למה? כי הוא קשה, והוא יכול לרצוח את מי שבא לו. לא תרצח! פשוט לא!
עוד שאלות.
לא, לא. ברשותך, אני אלך לעבוד את אלוהינו.
לחשוב עליה אם היא מתה זה לא נחשב, נכון?
They're very funny. I mean, if you get the Hebrew, there's also some subtle references in there too. You can find a few of their pieces online with subtitles, but it's a great example of we think of the Ten Commandments as this wonderful symbol, and everybody knows what they mean, and it's straightforward, and then they start asking questions like this. And there's also something particularly Israeli about the flavor of this challenging the authority and pushing back and pushing the envelope of what's acceptable. So it's a great example of that. Question?
What are the Jewish Orthodox take on this?
They don't watch that channel. No, this is aimed at the non-Orthodox audience because obviously this wouldn't meet criteria for Orthodox comedy. And there are other examples like that too. So it's a good example of how the symbol of the Ten Commandments is one thing, but what it actually means and how it plays out and the whole concept of commandments maybe is worth reevaluating. Another question?
What does Orthodox comedy look like?
What does Orthodox comedy look like? Well, it has to meet Orthodox standards. So that includes dress standards, that includes content standards. I mean, keep in mind, Orthodox Jews are people too, right? People laugh. People make jokes. People have fun. So, just because you're living in a traditionalist community doesn't mean even Christian fundamentalists have comedians and have make jokes and enjoy comedy. It just has to meet certain criteria of what's acceptable. And we might have looser boundaries on that. But don't forget that we have our boundaries too of what's acceptable now. I recently went and saw the Monty Python movie, The Life of Brian, which was re-released in theaters in certain areas. This year's the 40th anniversary of that. And some of you may recall when that film was first released, it was very controversial. There were boycotts and bans and protests, and nowadays everybody thinks of it as a great comedic movie that's sort of a send-off on the life of Jesus, but back then it was seen as blasphemous. What's fascinating about watching the film now, if you watch any comedy film 40 years later, some of the jokes aren't funny anymore because we don't joke like that anymore. There's a whole riff in that film about making fun of someone who has a speech impediment, who can't pronounce his R's. And then someone else in the film can't pronounce his S's. And so they're calling out names of people to be freed from prison. And the one with the R's is asked to say the name Roderick. So he says, Wadowick, and Wajur. And we don't make jokes like that anymore, making fun of people. So sometimes the jokes don't translate into other audiences. So yes, there is Orthodox humor beyond the scope of our topic for today. But I wanted to show you that example of how the Ten Commandments. What's great about that, though, is that the comedic troupe doesn't need to tell you what's going on. You know who the characters are right away. I didn't have to set that up for you, right? I didn't have to explain anything. I just had to show you you start the scene, and you saw the tablets like that, and that was it. And off you went. And that's the case for some Jewish symbols and ritual objects too. People just know what they are right away. You see a Torah scroll, you know what it is. You see a Jewish star, you're familiar with that symbol. Although it's interesting that the Jewish star didn't become identified with Jewish life until the later Middle Ages. If you go back and look at iconography from the Second Temple period, before the year 0, first 500 years when the Talmud is being written, you don't see Jewish stars on Jewish buildings because that wasn't one of the symbols they used. They would use the menorah with the 7 branches, which reminded them of the temple in Jerusalem. And you can see a great example of it on the Arch of Titus if you go to Rome, which was built after the destruction of Jerusalem and the looting of the temple. He made a picture of the menorah as well. But you see it in synagogues. You'll see examples of the incense shovels they used in the sanctuary. You'll sometimes see Torah scrolls, but you don't see the Jewish star until much later in Jewish life. So even what we think of as Jewish symbols and Jewish signs has evolved over time. You may remember I mentioned earlier this afternoon that supposed prohibition on making the human form that Maimonides listed, right? You shouldn't make images. Why not? Well, that's the image of God, remember? If we're made in God's image, then making a human picture is like making an image of God. Except, you can find all kinds of examples in ancient synagogues of the human form being depicted by Jewish artists. It happened all the time. So, again, they interpreted that commandment differently than Maimonides did 1,000 years later. The rabbis and the lay Jews making those synagogues took a very different approach. Now, when it comes to not just doing Jewish or being Jewish, but looking Jewish or having Jewish objects, that's again something for us to think about in terms of how does that apply to a secular or humanistic Jewish identity. When you think of Jewish clothing, okay, and I'm not talking about Mark Spitz's Speedo. What do we think of with Jewish clothing? We think of a yarmulke, right? There's some interesting debate over the origin of that term. It could be related to the Polish word for cap, or in Aramaic, it might be related to the phrase Yira Malka, which means fear of the king. The idea that you have to cover your head because you're always in the presence of the king, and you wouldn't go into the king's presence without having your head covered. Included in the packet that I gave out, I included a couple passages that describe where this idea of a yarmulke came from. So in the Talmud Kiddushin, which should be up there, Rabbi Hona ben Yashua never walked 4 cubits or 2 meters with his head uncovered. He explained, because the divine presence is always over my head. So the kippah, in the Hebrew term is kippah, or the yarmulke, it has its origins in this concept of the divine presence is always there. You always cover your head in the presence of God. It also points out that you need to always make sure you have proper clothing. Because after all, if God is everywhere, then you should be dressed appropriately. Make yourself neat and presentable before praying, especially praying, right? Even more important. One should not pray wearing only an undershirt, or bareheaded, or barefoot. If it is the custom of the people of that place to stand before the most respected people with shoes. So a basic dress code for the prayer service. And then it adds, Maimonides adds, it's customary to only pray when wrapped in a talit, the prayer shawl, which I'll talk about in a moment. So here's a passage in a code of Jewish law. The Shulchan Aruch is a code of Jewish law telling you exactly what to do. It describes this concept of the uncovered head. This is number 6. It is prohibited to walk 4 amot, again that's the 2 meters, or to utter sacred words with an uncovered head. Also, small children must be trained to cover their heads in order to encourage them to have reverence for God. As it is said of Rab Nachman bar Yitzhak, the mother was told by Kodai, your son will be a thief. Upon hearing this, she did not permit him to uncover his head. She said, cover your head in order that there be upon you the reverence of heaven. So even here, the rationale given for wearing the kippah, wearing the yarmulke, is piety. It's covering your head in the presence of and in respect for God, and even as an antidote to your natural tendency to become a thief, in this particular case. So that's the origin of this concept of covering the head. But I will point out to you that the commandment to cover your head is not one of those 613 commandments. It's not commanded at all, in fact. It's described as what's called a minhag, or a custom. So it's traditional, and some minhagim, some customs can become on a level of commandedness, but strictly speaking, it's not. You're not violating a commandment by not covering your head. And notice that even the passage in the Talmud said that you should make sure to cover your head. Sorry, no, it's a different one. Oh, you should not walk 4 amot or utter sacred words with an uncovered head. You could utter secular words in bed, right? You don't have to have your head covered at all times in all places, no matter what. But certainly to utter sacred words, one is expected to cover one's head because, again, it's evoking the divine presence, and you should be respectful to that. So remember that the implied audience for these commandments is men. In fact, this has become controversial in some modern Orthodox circles. Because you may have noticed that women have started wearing yarmulkes, kippot as well. It's a kind of reclaiming of the ritual, right? And sometimes they wear a different style of yarmulke than a man would. You might see more of these Yemenite style, sort of square hat yarmulkes, or more woven, colorful ones than just a plain black one. But you'll certainly see women rabbis wearing them more often, and even in Reform and Conservative congregations, you'll see more and more women wearing them. But for the Orthodox, that violates one of those commandments. A woman should not wear men's clothing, and a man should not wear women's clothing. So they would see a woman putting on a yarmulke as wearing man's clothing. They sometimes use the same rationale for why women shouldn't wear a talit or a prayer shawl, and why women shouldn't put on tefillin, because those are a man's thing. Of course, they're commanded to do those things, but the assumption is men are commanded to do those things. That's again one of those categories that women are exempt from. And when they say exempt, that often means not allowed to do. In the conservative movement, they allow women to voluntarily choose to fulfill those commandments, and so that's why in the conservative movement, women do wear a talit and pray at the appointed times and can serve in a minyan, and those are all things they can choose to fulfill. In the Orthodox world, if they're not commanded, it doesn't count, and they can't step in that role. And they also can't wear those clothing pieces. So you see the kippah and the yarmulke, the head covering, for some people, evokes Jewish identity and memory for them. It's what they always wore going to synagogue. They remember their grandparents wearing one all the time. But for others, it's an experience of exclusion. It's what they were not allowed to wear. It would define them as a second-class participant in the observance. And for still others, it becomes problematic because of this original rationale. I know plenty of people who do not believe in a God, who put on a yarmulke when they study Torah or when they're at a high holiday service because it feels Jewish. They do it because it feels familiar, it's what they're used to doing. It helps define the moment as Jewish space for them. For me, it wouldn't have that meaning. I've always experienced my Jewish life without the yarmulke on, and it makes me look and feel like a kind of Jew that I'm not. One that has that fear of heaven. And particularly as a rabbi, I don't want people to get a misapprehension of what kind of rabbi I really am. So that's why I don't personally wear one. In fact, my father had left Orthodoxy long before I was born, and so he didn't wear one in my lifetime unless we visited a traditional synagogue. And my mother's side, they were secular even further back. My great-grandfather was the one that took off the kippah on that side of the family. So my family minhag, my family tradition, is to not wear one at all. And once had the experience, I'm sorry, a couple questions, I'll come back in a sec. I once had the experience when I was doing a funeral. This was a co-officiated funeral between myself and an Orthodox rabbi, because one of the daughters of the deceased was secular and one of the daughters was Orthodox. So we worked out a kind of division of labor where I led the eulogy in the funeral home, and the Orthodox daughter's husband led the El Malei Rachamim prayer, God full of mercy, that's part of the funeral ritual. And then the Orthodox rabbi did the graveside service. So he could do whatever he wanted to in the graveside service to fulfill what they felt needed to be done from Orthodox perspective, but the secular partner got the eulogy done in the spirit that you wanted it done in the funeral home. So it actually worked out fine for both of the daughters. But after the funeral service, the Orthodox rabbi came up to me and he said, "I noticed your yarmulke blew off." And this is a classic example of, remember it said don't embarrass people, was one of the commandments? You give them the benefit of the doubt. So you don't say to them, "Why are you such a heretic that you wouldn't wear a yarmulke?" You say, "I noticed your yarmulke blew off," giving me the benefit of the doubt. And I understood that, and so I responded to him, "Well, it's not my minhag. It's not my custom." And he was very puzzled by that, because he had never experienced a Jewish community in which that was not de rigueur. That was what everyone did. But, in fact, for many of us, it is not our minhag. It is not our custom to do that. But I've always taken the approach when I do weddings. I tell couples at the outset, I don't wear a yarmulke. It's not meaningful to me. But everyone is in charge of their own head. If the bride wants a veil, she can wear a veil. If she doesn't want a veil, she doesn't have to wear a veil. My wife wore a tiara. She said, "When else can you pull off wearing a tiara?" If the groom wants to wear a yarmulke, that's fine. If he doesn't want to wear one, that's fine. Everyone's in charge of their own head. So when it comes to a community practice in a humanistic Jewish congregation, most of the men are not going to wear yarmulkes for a variety of reasons. But if anyone walks in with one, it's nobody's business. It's always been my approach. And unfortunately, I've had a couple of members of my community who actually told someone who walked in with a yarmulke, we don't do that here. Now that might have been the style actually even in some Reform temples in the 1950s. They would have told you, take off your hat, bare your head. That was the conventional style of how you show respect in a place of worship. Nowadays it'd be the other direction. But my approach is, people can, I don't care what you wear. There's no dress code coming in for these events, and certainly on your head, that's up to you. If it's meaningful to you, that's fine. If it's not, that's fine too. But from my perspective, it doesn't have meaning to me. And so that's why I make the choice that I do. Another example of ritual clothing we saw alluded to was the talis, the prayer shawl. One of the commandments is to wear a four-cornered garment with fringes on it. And so actually some Jews will wear what's called a talit katan, a mini prayer shawl. You remember that from Fiddler on the Roof, because Teddy is wearing one of those. That's to wear one all the time, but the talit is a special prayer shawl with a blue thread on it. In theory, you can use that to mark sundown or sunup when you're counting the time for the service to see when you can tell the blue thread from the rest of the garment. And there's a command of how many knots to have in the fringes, and there's all kinds of rules about how a talit is supposed to be made. Again, in some Orthodox circles, controversial because of women versus men's clothing. In some places, again, people feel very Jewish when they take the talit and put it on. They may have an heirloom they would want to give to a bar mitzvah student, and then it becomes meaningful for them to receive it. In other places, again, it feels like dressing up as someone who is more traditional. And so then it doesn't feel authentic to those people. Most humanistic congregations don't have a bin of yarmulkes and talisim sitting around for people to choose from. But if people walk in with them, ideally, they should be allowed to wear what they choose to wear, if it's meaningful to them. Now the blessing that's written on most of the talit has a Hebrew blessing running around the rim, and it's the traditional blessing. Blessed are you, our God, who commanded us to wear the talit, to wear the garment with fringes. I have had a couple of people who found it meaningful to make their own talit with what they wanted to say on it. So maybe it says, "Where is my light is in me," which is one of the songs that's popular in our movement. Or maybe it says, "Love your neighbor as yourself," or some other value that's of meaning to you, and then it becomes yours. So often we can work within the framework of a traditional object or item, but be creative with it, and find new meaning and new content and new ways to approach the texts that are involved. The question is, why is it in some congregations, Reformed congregations, a rabbi will wear a kippah and a talit, a head covering and the prayer shawl, when almost nobody else is doing it? Well, there's a couple of reasons why that might happen. One is, the rabbi finds it meaningful, and so he wears them even if nobody else does. It's for his purpose. In most Reformed synagogues, by the way, they will not tell you you have to put anything on. Their approach is, if it's meaningful to you, you can put it on. I've never been told when I go to a Reformed synagogue in the audience, in the congregation, you have to wear a yarmulke. They'll offer it to me, and I'll say no thanks, and that's the end of it. So there's going to be a diversity of head appearance in the audience in a Reformed congregation. In a conservative congregation, sometimes they'll say, you're required to wear a yarmulke. And any men going on the bima are required to wear a talit as well as a yarmulke. But in a Reformed context, it's up to what's meaningful, and maybe the rabbi finds it meaningful. Or another factor, and this is perhaps less generous, but might be more true. In some cases, the rabbi in a liberal congregation functions as the designated Jew. What that means is, I might not keep kosher, but the rabbi should keep kosher. I might not wear a talit, but the rabbi should. So there's a sense that the rabbi has to suffer on your behalf. It's actually a Christian concept, but you get the idea that the rabbi is the one expected to be the super Jew, the one that does everything, and the members can be a little bit more flexible on that. So maybe the rabbi either feels impelled to do that, or the congregation is just more comfortable if the rabbi, quote, looks Jewish by putting on the full costume, and therefore they feel more comfortable with him leading or her leading the service. And that might be part of the dynamic that's going on in that community. Yes, there are traditions of women covering their hair as well in Jewish practice, absolutely. It's from the same root that God is watching and you want to maintain your piety. There's also a sense of modesty and modesty rules that have been applied to women particularly, but also to men to some extent, that requires them to wear certain clothing and not wear certain clothing, and covering the hair or wearing a wig in the Orthodox circles is part of that modesty. That a woman's hair is thought to be provocative and tempting, and so it should only be seen by her husband, and so that's why it would be hidden by the wig. And then the covering of the hair with a doily or some other kind of covering is also part of that piety ritual. But here's where, again, the gender division comes in. In theory, if women have to cover their head, who cares what they cover their head with? Why not a yarmulke? But here's where they have to cover their head the way women cover their head. And a man couldn't wear the woman's scarf, because that would be violating that gender boundary in a traditional setting. But this is again why we, in a humanistic context, if we bring it back to who we are, and not those other people, we can choose to wear it or not, but many of us choose not to because of that history of gender binary and exclusion and a sense of policing women's clothing. You know, a lot of the Orthodox sects have these very strict rules of modesty of how long the skirts have to be and how long the sleeves have to be, and even how thick the tights have to be in some particular sects. And they blame women for bad things happening because they're not being careful enough with their modesty, and they've even rewritten history in some cases. There's a great book that came out 2 years ago where this man went back and he found versions of pictures of the Rebbe and his wife from a particular group from the 1920s, and she has short sleeves in the original pictures. But if you read the histories, the history books the group prints today, she has long sleeves in the new pictures because they photoshopped long sleeves in to make her meet the standards they have now, as opposed to the way they actually were back then. So, again, policing modesty is something we don't tend to do. I don't think I've ever turned anyone away from our services for not wearing appropriate clothing, even if I might have thought it once or twice, because there's a value there of saying people are in charge of their own life and we don't police what they wear. So when it comes to Jewish clothing, we might not necessarily wear those things, or we might choose other things that mark us as Jewish. Some might choose to wear a Jewish necklace. Could have the chamsa, that hand symbol with the eye in it. Could be a Jewish star. Some people actually wear a mezuzah as a necklace. You might have seen that before. Or a Jerusalem of gold, a picture of the Jerusalem skyline. There's all kinds of Jewish objects that one can wear to mark one as Jewish that don't include these traditional ritual objects. It could be your choice of t-shirt and what the t-shirt says. Someone just got me a new t-shirt. I love it. It has a picture of a Jewish star at the top, and it says, "Keep calm and ask the rabbi." I'll also point out one more detail here. In the same passage that says to cover your head, it points out you should be careful not to walk between two women. And similarly, two men should not permit a woman to walk between them. Again, keep things separate and always worrying about appearances. Now, this is not the only example of Jewish ritual objects that might be interesting for us to explore or think about from a humanistic perspective. For example, a Kiddush cup. Is there anything ideologically problematic about a silver cup that you use for ceremonial events? No. And heirloom cups can be beautiful. And new cups can be designed in very creative ways. And you can make your own example of a Kiddush cup with the words that you would want on it. In fact, most Kiddush cups that you'll see don't even have the full blessing on it. It just says Borei Pri Hagafen on it. So you put whatever you want in the first half of that blessing if you want to do something creative. Kiddush cup is one example. A tzedakah box, a charity box. That could be done in any number of different ways. A mezuzah for the doorpost. Again, a million different designs are possible. Traditionally, on the mezuzah, which is a little marker on the doorpost, we'll talk about the text in a minute, you would have the letter Shin on the outside, or occasionally the word Shaddai, Shin Dalet Yud, which means the Almighty. But Shin, as the first letter of a word, could stand for Shalom. It could stand for the phrase Shalom Bayit, peace in the home. It could stand for any number of things. Or you don't have to have a letter on it at all. You can choose what doors to put it on and so on. We do a whole workshop with my congregation on making your own mezuzah. So what would be in the mezuzah and where does it come from? This comes from a passage in the Bible that says, well, we'll actually take a look at it. This is the text that you would see in the Hebrew. You see it there in a sort of Torah-style font with the crowns on the letters. And here's the English translation. Normally, you'd only have the Hebrew text in the mezuzah box. It starts with the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God is one Yahweh. You will love him with all your heart and all your soul, with all your might. And these words which I command you this day will be in your heart. You will teach them seriously to your children. You will talk about them when you sit in your house, when you walk on the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. And you will tie them like a sign on your hand. They will be like signposts between your eyes. And you will write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. In fact, the word for doorpost is mezuzah. So mezuzah doesn't just mean the box, it means the doorpost. So the mezuzah goes on the mezuzah. The box goes on the doorpost. And this is a case of rabbinic literalism. Here, Deuteronomy is saying, these words are really important. Say them all the time. Think about them all the time. But the rabbi said, oh, it says when you lie down and when you get up. So you must say the Shema when you go to bed and say the Shema when you wake up. When you leave the house to walk on the road, say the Shema. When you sit down in your house, say the Shema. Oh, it says tie them like a sign. Let's put the words in a box and tie them on my hand. It says put them on the doorpost. Oh, we should put these words on the door. These words should go on the doorpost. So it's taking it very, very literally. And then it goes on with another passage that gives you the reason why you do this. It will happen if you really listen to my commandments. I command you today to love your God and serve him with all your heart and soul. I will give you the rain on your land in its regular season, the first rain and the later rain to harvest your grain and wine and oil. Be careful your heart is not tricked, and you turn away and serve other gods and worship them, because then Yahweh will be very angry with you. He will close the sky so there is no rain, and the land will make no food, and you will disappear quickly from the good land he gives you. And again, the passage saying, write them on the doorposts and tie them as a sign, and so on. So what is on the mezuzah in the traditional text in the box is the text that says, put these words in your box, and if you do so, you'll be rewarded, and if you don't do so, you will suffer.
So those words come from where?
These are from Deuteronomy.
What does that mean?
Deuteronomy is the fifth book in the Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So it's the fifth book in the Torah. Direct quote, and enacted directly. Now, if you're a humanistic Jew, secular Jew, considering putting a mezuzah on your door, you probably are not doing it because the Torah told you to. Because there are plenty of other things the Torah tells you to do that you don't do. Okay? So that's not the primary reason. But there are other reasons why a secular and cultural Jew might want to put a mezuzah on their doorpost. For one thing, they might have always had a mezuzah on their doorpost. Another, it marks the home as a Jewish home. There are a lot of ways to mark a home as a Jewish home, by the way. You can have Jewish books, you can have menorahs and Seder plates and other Jewish objects, you can have Jewish people, you can have Jewish experiences. There's a lot of ways to make a home a Jewish home. It doesn't have to be a mezuzah, but that's one way that some people choose to do it. And they might like the idea of having some words that define the space for them at the entrance to their door. The question is whether these words define the space the way we would want to define the space, if that's the reason behind it. And so, again, just like you can write new text in a ketubah, and you can create new ceremonies for weddings, you can have both of the couple break a glass, you can put new words into a mezuzah text. And so I've given some examples, again this is in your packet, of other texts that might work. This first passage is something called Blessing of the House. I've seen this as an artwork in a lot of different homes. That says basically, in this space may everything go well. And it rhymes into Hebrew. B'zot hashar lo yavot sa'ar. B'zot hadira lo tavot sarah. B'zot hadelet lo tavo bahelet. It's also sort of a almost Dr. Seuss-y kind of rhyme. And in the English, in this gate may there be no sadness. In this room may there be no misfortune. Through this door may there be no fear. In this group may there be no argument. And in this place may there be blessing and peace. Very nice sentence, right? And that reflects what you would want to define the space to be. I also included some other examples of texts you might choose to include. Some of you know the Malvina Reynolds song, Little Boxes. Little boxes on the hillside. It's a wonderful satire of suburban, sprawl and materialism. But I also like the idea of a little box on the door, so I make a song called Little Boxes. This song, Peace Be With You, is one that my congregation uses. It's a nice sentiment. Hine ma tov, again, celebrates people being together, literally to shevet gam yachad, to dwell together. This is a dwelling. This is a nice poem by the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai called My Head, where he bangs his head on a door, but what he finds comfort in is not in the transcendent, but in the interpersonal, the comfort he finds from another person, and from his own personal experience. It's a nice sentiment as well. Eifori, Where's My Light Again, might work. You might choose to do a humanistic version of the Shema, and this one has both the one-liner, Shema Yisrael, Echad Amenu Adam Echad, Hear, O Israel, our people is one, humanity is one, and then the Marsha Falk piece that we had in the service last night. By the way, just as an aside, this humanistic version of a Shema is singable to the old melody. So you could sing Shema Yisrael, Echad Amenu Adam Echad. And again, for some people that will work, and they like it, they like the melody, and now it has words they believe in. And for other people, ugh, changed it doesn't feel right, I feel inauthentic, and if I'm going to do it, I did this once actually at Birmingham Temple when I was a rabbinic intern, and it was risky to do it, because they'd never done something like this. I offered it, and I said to people, tell me what you think about it. And afterwards I got two diametrically opposed positions. Some people said, I love it, I've missed that melody, we should do this every week. And I had other people who said, if you're going to do it, do the old one or don't do it at all. I'm fine either way, but don't change it. So you can't win. There's no one answer that's going to fit everybody. So that's an option for us as well, is taking the mezuzah and making it into something new, creative, different. And you can do that with a Haggadah, you can do that. There's all kinds of Jewish ritual objects that you can make more relevant and interesting to you. There's one example I pulled up here, some images of a Seder plate. As you may know, there's now not just one way to do a Seder plate, because there's all kinds of new symbols that people have come up with. You almost need a second Seder plate for all the new symbols that people have come up with for Passover. You've got the orange, which is an interesting story in itself. People have heard the legend that it was about women becoming rabbis. Actually, it was originally about gays and lesbians being involved in Jewish life. But that was a bridge too far in the 1980s, so they changed it to be about women, as opposed to being about gays and lesbians. But originally, that was the meaning. Some people put a potato peel on their Seder plate to remember the Holocaust. Some people put a pomegranate to remember Jewish diversity. Some people put a tomato or a grape to remember farm workers. Some people, there's all kinds, you may have heard of other symbols that are included on the Seder plate as well. So what a Seder plate looks like now is not going to be what you used to think of as the Seder plate with the same symbols for everybody. And I'll show you one other example of this, which is how we do Hanukkah. So let me get this started. Slideshow start. Okay. Okay, good. So this is the standard style of menorah you might be used to seeing. Okay? You've got 8 lights all on one level, and the shamas, the lighter candle, is a little bit higher or set aside from that. And that's actually following the rules of rabbinic practice. That you have to have 8 in a row, and then the shamas has to be separate or distinct from the other candles. And this follows more or less the model of that Jerusalem menorah that was with 7 lights. Remember, that was for the 7 days of the week. This is a 9-candle menorah for Hanukkahs. And some people make a distinction between a menorah, which could be either 7 or 9, and a Chanukiah, which is specifically for Hanukkah, so it has to have 9. In fact, the word menorah itself just means candelabra. The word ner is candle, so a menorah is a candelabra. Same root. So this is a design you might be used to seeing. This is a very different design. Okay? It still has the 4 lights more or less on the same level, but also a lot of other circles and designs and so on. It doesn't have to always be the traditional format. Oh, sorry, wrong way. Skipping some of the text here because we're not doing the Hanukkah presentation. There's that 7-candle menorah I mentioned from the Arch of Titus that you'll see if you go to Rome. We'll skip this. Here's another example of a menorah. It's an oil menorah. You would fill it with the pool with oil and drop wicks in to each of the holes for each of the nights, and the main light would be up here. So you'd have one wick coming off of here that was the shamus, and then you'd have your separate wicks for the different nights coming off the bottom of this oil menorah. Again, looks very different from what we're used to seeing as a menorah, but why not? And jumping forward a few more. Here's sort of a standard design you've probably seen before. So you've got the 8 lights here and the shamus on the end a little bit higher. This is supposedly depicting the Maccabees, and they're fighting on the cruise, the miracle of oil, which we talked about before. Okay. Jump forward for a couple more. Here's again a more or less standard design that you'd be used to seeing. And now we're going to get to some more creative pieces. So these are often symbols you remind you of Hanukkah. So here, the very different design, right? They're all over the place. You can't even necessarily tell which the Shabbos is. This is also mentioning that there was a debate in the Talmud over what order you light the candles. Do you go 1, 2, 3, 4 and up, or do you do 8, 7, 6, 5 and count down? And in one family I know, they actually do it both ways. They have one menorah going up, one menorah going down, and it reminds the kids there's no one answer. There's always been debate and discussion over how to do these things. Here are a lot of different designs coming from different parts of the Jewish world. So here's an example of a menorah built in the south of France that evokes this scene from the Chartres Cathedral, of all places. Because they're walking around town, they look up, they see this beautiful window, and they thought, oh, they might include that in the design of their menorah. Here's another one that evokes these wooden synagogues from Poland with lions and deer and that kind of iconography reflected in the menorah as well. Here's one coming from Algeria, and you can see the archways for the oil lamps to go in at the bottom. Looks very much like the kind of architecture that you might see in one of the buildings in the area. And notice the detailed scroll, ornate, carving work there. Again, very evocative of Islamic style art. That might be strange to us, but it's par for the course there. Here's another example of a palace in Venice, and you see how the archways here become the archways at the bottom of the menorah, done in a different time and place. And you can be creative. So here's a wine cork menorah. You can make a menorah out of a banana. Just pop it in there. You have the Noah's Ark version, and this one that looks like a dinosaur is sometimes called the Menorahsaurus Rex. Here's a Lego menorah with Lego flames. You've got this very cool sort of modernist, minimalist design with the curves and the lines. You've got one with trees. Here's one that looks like chess. You can get Harry Potter menorahs. There's a million different designs. This is something they sell called the Hanukkah kit, where you don't even need a menorah. You just have all the lights you need. You have the 2 lights for the first night, the Shabbos plus, and so on all the way down. You just light them and they burn down, and no menorah needed at all. Of course, you could light oil for the light, which was traditional. You could even just use the matches. Make those your 8 lights. There's even an app you can get for your phone. It's called Light My Fire. It's done by the Jewish Museum in New York. And what they've done is they've taken their collection of menorahs and made them into images. You see this modern square one here, and you can sort of scroll through the designs, pick what design you want, and pick what background you want, and then you use your hand to sort of strike the light, and then move the Shabbos light over and light the candles, so you can actually light my fire, light your Hanukkah menorah on your phone with all different kinds of designs. So there's no one way to make a menorah either. You see, this is again the advantage of thinking of Jewish life not as a set of rules, commandments, and regulations you have to follow, but as a cultural inheritance that you can adapt and reshape and be creative with and bring your own values to bear as you celebrate it. So I see it as available as a resource library. Some elements may be more easily consistent with a secular and humanistic approach. Others may be a stretch too far for some people, but it's all available to us as an option for us to explore and find ways to connect with our past. Again, if I inherit my great aunt's attic, some of it's relevant to me, some of it's not, but it's all mine. It's all part of my life. I think what happens in the surrounding culture will make a big difference. I'll give you an example. If I took you back 100 years ago, to 1919, and you took a picture of the Jewish world back then, who would have guessed we'd be where we are now? The American Jewish community was mostly immigrants who didn't even speak English. Most of them spoke Yiddish. The German Jewish community wanted nothing to do, or little to do, with the Eastern European Ashkenazi Yiddish community. The Jewish community in Israel was teeny tiny, barely there, and almost been wiped out by the Ottomans during the First World War. The largest Jewish community in the world was in Poland, which had almost 3 million Jews there. But they were desperately poor too. The Zionist movement was going nowhere, and the largest Jewish political parties were Jewish socialism. The Soviet Revolution had just happened, and everyone thought, wow, that's the future. Well, 100 years later, post-Holocaust, post-founding of Israel, post-Soviet collapse of Soviet Jewry, and then collapse of the Soviet Union itself, who knew we would wind up where we are now? So I'm reluctant to predict the future too much. I like to say that prophecy is gone and we're a non-profit organization, just philosophically. But I think what will matter is the surrounding culture. So what we're finding, as one example, younger Jews, millennial Jews, are identifying more and more frequently as Jews by culture, or what they call Jews of no religion. These are people who say, I'm not religious, but I'm Jewish in some way. In that Pew study I mentioned from 2013, 25% of American Jews identified as Jews but not religious. 33% or 32% of millennials who are Jewish identified as Jews of no religion. So that number is going up. So that might mean more people might be interested in what we're doing, if they're interested in joining anything, which they might not be. And after all, if you live in a city like New York or Los Angeles or Miami, you might have enough peers who are Jews to create your own sense of community without creating a congregation at all. And maybe it's a mixed community and you don't want to join any one label, and so you wouldn't necessarily pursue a movement that's focused on that. One of the things I'm working on trying to think about is how we can serve people who aren't members of our organized movements. There will be people who want to join an ideological movement. That's great. There will also be people who want to dabble. They take a yoga class here and a Buddhist meditation class there, and they might read a work of secular Jewish history, and then they might go to daven in a synagogue, and then they might go for a hike in the woods the next Shabbat, and they're going to explore around. And we have to find ways to both stay relevant and stay in business that serve those needs and those people who are looking for something once in a while, episodically, not necessarily a full identity. So I think that we're going to shift the kind of things that we do. I think the content will stay the same. I think it's a winning message, and I think it's relevant. I think the growing secularization is going to reinforce the need for a non-religious alternative in Jewish life, if people want to stay Jewish. What I honestly hope is that the organized Jewish community gets their act together and finds ways to include us better. There are still communities where they won't list our events in the Jewish newspaper, which is dumb. Because why not find more places for people to find a comfortable home in the Jewish world?
You mean the newspapers are forbidding
The Jewish newspapers won't list humanistic Jewish community events or involve us in certain communal boards and so on. And it's short-sighted, it's ridiculous, but unfortunately, see, 30 years ago, the Jewish community's response to intermarriage was, I'm going to plug my ears and close my eyes and hope it goes away by saying la 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 la. And it didn't work, because 30 years later, there's still large numbers of families intermarrying. So, the organized Jewish community has changed to outreach and inclusion. More rabbis will officiate at weddings, more synagogues will accept intermarried families as members, even in the conservative movement, which was unthinkable 30 years ago.
They do?
Yes, they'll accept, it depends on the congregation, but they're now allowed to accept non-Jews as members if they're married to a Jewish person. They can't go on the bima necessarily, but that's an ongoing question. So that's improved. what needs to happen is they need to accept cultural Jews, Jews of no religion, the way that they're now accepting intermarried couples. And that means funding organizations and supporting ones that serve their needs, that may not serve the Jewish establishment's perspective of what counts. They're there on intermarriage in most cases in the organized Jewish community. They're not there on the secular and cultural Jews. It may take us another 10 or 20 years for them to get there, but as we have the numbers, then at some point they'll have to listen. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm interested in knowing if children of secular and humanist Jewish families are not, in general, getting bar and bat mitzvah. Is that
No, most of them are.
most of them are?
The ones that join communities tend to join the communities that have a school, that have a program.
Okay, but the school, it would be like the full-time school would be a Jewish school?
Sunday school.
No, you're talking about Sunday school.
Yeah, Sunday school.
Right.
No, there are no secular Jewish day schools
Yeah.
in this country
Yeah. Okay, good.
that I know
All right.
of. There are some Hebrew charter schools that are public schools that are focused on Hebrew language. There are some in Miami, there's a couple in New York, I think.
Right.
And they often will serve Israelis who want their kids to come up fluent in Hebrew. Technically, they can't do religion because they're a public school, so it's a charter school. It's just a language school, like a Japanese culture school or a Spanish language school. And that's one solution that some secular Jews have come to if they want a more intense, at least Hebrew language, Israeli culture association. A lot of them do supplementary schools. And those who are part of our movement, they send their kids to our Sunday schools and get that experience. So the question is whether there's other ways for people to get a Jewish education other than a kind of pre-bar mitzvah education process. And I mean, honestly, there are alternatives. Some people will hire a tutor and work with a tutor for a year or two. And that can include content. It's not just, here's how to read the Hebrew and that's it at the end. Some people, by the way, we always have people who go through our education program who don't have a bar or a bat mitzvah. They just come for the learning. It's not about the event for them, it's about knowing something. And the parents are sending them because they want them to know something.
So that education program is offered by a synagogue?
Yeah, it's by our congregation that does it.
Yeah.
Now, there used to be Jewish community schools, a United Hebrew School or some version like that, where you could send your kid without being a member, but those don't really exist anymore other than day schools. And many secular Jews wouldn't want to do that. However, there is this wonderful thing called the internet, which can suck your time in bad ways, or can be an opportunity. There are all kinds of online classes and lectures and learning experiences, but that requires someone to have an interest.
Yeah.
And we can't make people want to learn who are teenagers. Okay, it's very tough. So what happens is you see people blame the institutions, but we get the kids for a very small percentage of their time. What they found is very determinative for Jewish identity going forward. Number one is going to a Jewish summer camp because it's peer experience, because it's fun, because it's outdoors, and because it's an immersive experience. It's a lot of Jewish all the time. The second level is... Are we done? Okay. The second level is family experience and what happens in the home. Very far down the list. And number three is some kind of outside of the home Jewish educational experience. Even if you send them to a day school, what happened, they have so many more hours in the home with the family than with the institution. So it really depends on the parents and the family of, do they make Jewish stuff a priority so that the kids see Shabbat candles being lit, Hanukkah candles being lit, a Passover Seder being held, are there Jewish books on the bookshelf? There's a wonderful new program based on this concept. It started about 6 or 7 years, no, more than that, maybe like 8 years ago. It's called PJ Library. Some of you may have heard of it. What PJ Library does is you can sign up, the PJ like pajamas, PJ Library. You can sign up for your kid, you put in your kid's age, and they'll send you an age-appropriate Jewish content book every month until the kid turns 11 or 12 years old. And when they turn 11, they get to do something else called PJ Your Way, where they get to pick one of 2 or 3 books. It's a young adult book, and the books are great. 90% of them are totally secular appropriate. They're about Golda Meir, or about Harry Houdini, or famous Jews out of history, or about Jewish values. One is called Do Unto Otters. It's all about animals, with the otters. And they're great. They have a little panel on the back that has, here's some Jewish values related to this. And again, 90% of it is totally secular appropriate. Occasionally we get a book about Moses goes up to Sinai and meets God, and okay, fine. But it's a free book every month, and good quality art, good quality content, not the old Jewish publishing from the 80s. It's really good stuff. And this is funded by philanthropists who know the lesson that if there are Jewish books on the bookshelf, the kids will see them, and they'll pick them up once in a while, and they'll read them. And it creates Jewish experience in the home, which is much more determinative. They could have spent that money on funding Sunday school tuition, but they knew that getting people in the home was more important. So that home experience is way higher on the level of what's going to determine Jewishness than anything I can do in the 2 hours I get on Sunday morning. I do my best, but in the end, it's the families that make the difference.